And so now we're lucky to be joined in person by Dr. Garrett Felber, author of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, the Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State. And our special guests, we will have audio clips from prison abolitionist Safear Ness and also prison abolitionist Stevie Wilson, who are currently incarcerated. And also we hope that after the break, we can be joined live on the phone from the prison by Stevie Wilson. So Dr. Garrett Felber, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I'm so honored to be with you all tonight. So thanks for the invite.
Excellent, excellent. It is so great that you're joining us teachers, because you know, for each one of these teachers that you speak to this evening, you're going to be reaching like 150 other students. And we are going to spread this message about the struggle to undo the prison industrial complex. And, you know, I really was fascinated by your book. I realized that I myself had some master narratives about the Nation of Islam in my head that I hadn't undone yet. And so I learned quite a bit. You know, I think it really deepened my understanding of the Black freedom struggle in general and specifically the NOI. So thank you for that. And you write, you know, I think you write in the book, Muslim activism has largely been erased in historical accounts of Black power, absent from the major uprisings in Harlem in 1964, in Watts in 1965, and Attica in 1971 that defined the era. And so what happens to our understanding of those uprisings and of the Nation of Islam and you know, the Black freedom struggle more generally when we understand the role that the NOI played in them?
Well, thanks for the question. And again, just thank you everyone, to the organizers and all the educators and folks here in the audience tonight. So yeah, I should say, when I wrote this book, it's not an organizational history of the Nation of Islam. I was concerned largely with this question that you posed, which is what happens when we put the NOI at the center of the mid-century Black freedom struggle. And I think it does a couple of things that are helpful, not just historically, but also for our movements today. And one of them is just thinking about the central role of Black nationalism during that movement. So oftentimes when we talk about Black nationalism or we teach it, there's this sort of golden age of Black nationalism with the UNIA and the Garveyite movement. And then it's seen as sort of in recession during the heart of what we might see as the classical civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And then there's this blossoming, right, of SNCC and the Black Panthers and sort of the late 60s moment. And I think the Nation of Islam helps bridge that. There's a point really where my students, it sort of clicks for them, because they often say, well, Malcolm X was the Black Power movement, right? And it's like, but Malcolm, you know, is assassinated before the phrase Black Power is ever sort of shouted amongst a mainstream movement. So how do we make sense of that? And in part, we make sense of it because the nation during the 50s and 60s is really carrying that torch of Black nationalism forward during the heart of a movement that we often don't associate with Black nationalism. And I think that's important in part because it offers a sort of dissonance in that movement. So if we think about the civil rights movement as really this struggle between desegregation and segregation, the Nation of Islam is talking about racial separation. And Malcolm's talking about racial separation as distinct from segregation in the sense that it's something between two equals, rather than segregation, which is imposed by oppressor upon oppressed. And the reason I think that's useful for us in thinking about social movements more generally is that these are not coherent, ideologically coherent, consistent struggles. There's all sorts of argument about what we're fighting for, what strategies to use. So I think that's really valuable, because often people talk about in contemporary movements, right, when there's dissonance, everyone's sort of worried about unity. Is this, a falling apart? And I think it's just a good reminder to understand that there's always a really healthy argument happening within social movements over strategies and goals. And then I think lastly, and perhaps most importantly for me, when you center the Nation of Islam within the mid-century Black freedom struggle, you're necessarily centering some of the most criminalized folks. So the Nation was organizing people who were currently and formerly incarcerated. The Nation was surveilled and policed and brutalized during the 50s and 60s, as I document in the book, as much as, or perhaps more than other folks within Black communities. And they were responding to that and organizing around things like solitary confinement and police murders. So what that does then is it sort of shifts our focus to not seeing the prisoners' rights movement and even contemporary abolition as kind of a post-civil rights struggle, but something that people are always contending with within these movements. And so, just like our social movements are stronger when we're focused on the most marginalized people, our histories are also better when we do that.
Yeah, no doubt. I found your discussion of their refusal to serve in the military really fascinating too, and their conscientious objector status, and then the way they brought social movements into the prisons was fascinating to me. I have a grandfather who was a conscientious objector in World War II, which was a very marginalizing position to be in at the time. So that was really interesting to me. But I want to just ask everyone with us here a poll question in regards to K-12 education, because I want to find out how many folks learned about the conditions of those who are incarcerated in prison, or organizing or rebellions in prison, or learned about mass incarceration in their own time in school. So we have a poll that just popped up, so we can find out from the educators who are with us today if they've learned about this or taught about it before. All right, so those are coming in right now. Click on the poll. Tell us about your experience in school. All right, we'll come back to that in just a second when it's done. But Garrett, I was hoping you could tell us more about how you met Stevie Wilson, who's imprisoned right now. And he was at Cy Fayette prison, but I believe you said that he was recently transferred. And hopefully you could tell about how you met him and his work around prison abolition.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to the whole team for working with us to make sure that we get those voices on calls like this. Yeah, so Stevie was at Fayette, had been in solitary confinement since December, really throughout much of the planning of this event, as sort of trumped up charges for his organizing inside, and was just recently, with the help of outside agitation, people doing phone zaps and things, we got him out of solitary and transferred to Camp Hill, which is where he'll be calling from today. Stevie and I met, I think maybe almost 2 or 3 years ago, or got in contact. I was a little bit frustrated. I had gotten into some of the kind of higher education and prison work, and was realizing the way that sort of operating between the twin institutions of the university and the prison winds up creating a lot of censorship and limitations around the possibilities for what you can teach and the types of relationships and organizing that you can do. So started a program that was really, building on sort of the lessons of Ella Baker and others, that people have sort of all the tools to organize themselves. Really, this was a program that was dedicated to sending radical books inside to facilitate self-led reading groups inside. So Stevie was someone who was suggested as a host. So we got that program going. That study group was in 2018. And then really since then, I mean, Stevie's involved in all sorts of stuff, of which I'm just sort of co-conspirating a little bit of. Another thing that we spent about a year working on was a roundtable discussion on the imprisoned Black radical tradition that we did for Black Perspectives, if people are familiar with that blog, from the African American Intellectual History Society. So Stevie came up with a first round of questions, sent them through me to Dylan Rodriguez and Joy James and Dan Berger, Toussaint Lozier, a bunch of folks who study prison abolition. And we did sort of two rounds.
Here in my area.
Yeah.
Great work.
Yeah. So yeah, we just continue to organize together. And Stevie can share a lot more about, I hope, about the types of study groups that he runs inside.
Excellent. Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing from him. So I just wanted to show everyone the polls that came out here. So we have over 200 educators or community members joining us here in this forum tonight, and only 13% said that they learned about the conditions of those who are in prison in school. Only 7% said they learned about prison organizing or rebellions in school. 17% said they learned about mass incarceration. 28% said they learned or taught about one or more of the above, but over 52% said they have not learned about any of the preceding questions. So I think that unequivocally shows the urgency of us revealing the conditions of mass incarceration in a country that has over 2 million people incarcerated. For students not to learn about those conditions is really appalling. So it really shows the need for this session today. And we had a chance to ask Stevie some questions before this session, and so I wanted to turn to some of the audio that we have of Stevie. So the question for Stevie that we asked was, what should teachers and students know about prisons and the people inside of them? And Garrett took that question and asked it to Stevie, and I think we have the audio ready to play.
Yeah, listening to the first question.
What would I want them to know about people in prison or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Amen. What should teachers and students know about prisons, the people inside them? And I said immediately that, first of all, that there are people in prison. There were people, the human beings inside of prison. And I think that's lost so much of the time, that people realize that there are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, cousins, wives, husbands, lovers, friends inside of prison, and that they're people. And often we treat them as subhumans. All right, and so we have to understand that, once again, that everything that happens, we're doing to people. The fact that we're putting people in cages. We're putting people in cages and isolating them. All right, that's what we're doing. So remember that we're dealing with our people. I think that's one of the things I really want to get stressed to them, is that we're dealing with people.
Right on. That's so important, just to humanize people who our system is systematically trying to dehumanize. Then I believe I also asked him a question about if Stevie could talk about the environmental racism where the prison that he was in is located. And I think we have the audio ready that Garrett was able to transmit that question to him.
I'm going to talk about a little bit too also about the relationship between the environmental racism of where the prison is located and the racism of the response to this public health crisis. I think Ruthie Gilmore talks about, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, is that she's talking about environmental racism, right? You have black and brown people being taken from urban neighborhoods to these toxic rural sites, right? At the same time, poor white rural folks are being subjected to this also, because these toxic sites are being situated where they live. Like, for instance, Fayette is in LaBelle, Pennsylvania, and the people in LaBelle are fighting too. The people in LaBelle are sick. They are fighting just as much as the prisoners are fighting. But too often they're fighting alone, instead of the people in LaBelle fighting alongside the prisoners and the prisoners fighting alongside the people in LaBelle. It's two separate movements. And so what needs to happen is that they need to come together and understand that we're all sick. There's a higher rate of cancer in LaBelle amongst the civilians and amongst the prisoners. They're both dealing with respiratory issues and skin ailments and stuff like that. So we need to understand that they're impacted by this coal ash dump. This humongous coal ash dump in LaBelle is impacting everybody. And so they're situating these areas in rural, poor areas, a lot of poor white folk, or in black and brown, poor urban areas. So you see it's still poor folk who are being exposed to environmental racism, whether it's poor urban folk or whether it's poor black and brown, poor rural folk or poor urban folk who are being transported to these rural areas. And so there is a connection, and the thing is that they need to come together and fight alongside one another.
Yes, we do need to come together in this struggle. It is really inspiring to hear those words with everybody here, that even though they have tried to lock him up and make him invisible to the world, that his message is reaching us all. It's just like hitting me right now in a really powerful way. So thank you for bringing those words to us, Dr. Felber. And we want to hear from another prison abolitionist that you've worked with, Safear Ness. And I believe he's also currently incarcerated at Fayette. Is that correct?
Yeah, SCI. Yeah. So Stevie and Safear were both incarcerated at Fayette, and now since Stevie got transferred, Safear's still there and doing organizing there with study groups.
Excellent. Well, thank you for getting the audio and the interview question to Safear as well. And I also had him respond to a question in advance about the prison's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think we have a picture of Safear that we can share in the Google chat so everyone can see him.
I wasn't able to get a picture, but we do. He's an editor for In the Belly zine, so we were posting a link to that.
Okay, great, perfect. So people can see his work there. And now we're going to get to hear his words about the impact of COVID-19 on the prison.
I'm Safear. I'm a Muslim and a prison abolitionist, currently incarcerated at SCI Fayette Prison in Pennsylvania. It's no secret that the DOC's response to COVID has been disastrous. It's been a combination of traumatic lockdowns combined with negligence and screening and testing, especially screening and testing the people that are actually going to bring the virus in, which would be the COs and the prison staff. Also, testing of prisoners, been horrible. I'm on a block, and that right before I moved here, COVID swept through this block. I got comrades whose cellies became sick. Then they were forced to stay confined with them until they got sick too. People I know over here got paperwork in right now because their cellies tested positive for COVID and medical refused to test them. Instead, the prison chose to test sewage levels to determine if COVID cases were increasing or decreasing in the facility. What I mean is, instead of choosing to test people individually, they choose to test everyone's feces collectively to determine how many COVID cases are in the prison.
Yeah, thank you. Before I move on to the next question, I don't know, Garrett, if you have just any comments on any of the questions that they responded to, or any more background information about either of them or the study groups that they're organizing.
I mean, one, the COVID response that he's talking about, I just want to say that is not at all unique to that prison. It's not at all unique to the PA-DOC. Most of the folks that I've been organizing with over the last year through Study and Struggle in Mississippi reported similar things of the state just refusing to test people, because essentially their logic is if we don't have to show that people are getting COVID, then we don't have to deal with the problem of COVID. And of course, in all of these states, abolitionists were pressing for commutations, which is firmly within the purview of the governors, and they just haven't done it. So I just want to say that. And then I'll talk a little bit later, I think, about the study groups when we talk about Study and Struggle and prison censorship.
Yeah, right on. I know that there are places where there were prisoners let out because of the COVID crisis, but I don't know how that happened or how widespread that is, and if there's anything we can learn from that.
I mean, what we can learn is that until people inside are seen as human, and that the public outside sees the public health crisis that's going on outside as one that's incredibly exacerbated by inside conditions, right? I mean, there's nowhere worse during a pandemic than people being warehoused, either like Safear describes, 2 people in a cell, or the sort of mass warehousing where you have bunk beds, right? So that's it. And until we actually put enough pressure and enough people believe that folks, because that's what it is. I mean, these governors have the powers, and they don't do it because it's not a winning political move. So we need to organize to make that unsustainable for them.
Yeah, no doubt. It's just, it's amazing. Like, obviously the virus is brought in from the outside, and yet they can't escape or control any of the conditions of their safety. So it's particularly cruel. Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to return to some of the lessons in your book now that I think are so important as we think about how to get out of the prison industrial complex, how to envision a different kind of world without prisons. And you write about the wide-ranging organizing strategies of the NOI in the book. And you said, quote, Muslims in the Nation of Islam, confronted with police violence and state surveillance, responded with nonviolent prayer. Where do such stories fit in our narrative of the civil rights era? So I was wondering if you could talk more about the political strategy and the wide-ranging actions that the NOI took against police brutality and the carceral state. You write about actions they took in the courtrooms, inside the prisons, and also in the streets.
Yeah, so one of these, I think the passage that you're talking about in the book is actually responding to this scene. It's at Folsom Prison in the early 1960s. And basically, this group of Muslims are sitting in the yard having a meeting, and they're under surveillance by prison guards. And when they see that these photos are being taken, they sort of purposefully stand in prayer and face Mecca. And thinking about in 1961, right, a decade before Attica, which is, I think, where a lot of people's sort of consciousness about the prisoners' rights movement begins, that they're sort of responding to surveillance with prayer and trying to place that, again, within the civil rights narrative, it doesn't quite fit with what we have, right? So actually, I'll start with this story about you mentioned the streets, because I think that's like maybe a touchstone that everyone has. So anyone who's read the autobiography of Malcolm X or taught it or seen the Spike Lee film knows this scene with Johnson X. Hinton. He's beaten by police, taken to the police precinct. There's this crowd that sort of gathers outside the precinct, and the Fruit of Islam form this kind of, disciplined phalanx around it. And then once Malcolm gets him transferred to Harlem Hospital, he kind of waves and everyone silently disperses. And there's even this famous line, "No one man should have that much power," right? That this cop says. And I talk about that in the book because in both the autobiography and Spike Lee's film, it's sort of this exceptional moment. And the lesson is clear, right? It's about Malcolm X's power. And I actually think that's not the lesson that we should take from that, because the NOI did this routinely. They constantly were in front of courthouses when Muslims were being charged with usually resisting arrest or assault when they themselves were the victims of police violence, or outside police precincts. And the lesson there really is not just about Malcolm's power, but about the power of collective discipline. That all of these folks there that night sort of gathered and scared police. Like the thing that was scarier to them than an actual uprising was the fact that this uprising could be controlled in that way. And I think that's such a powerful lesson for us, right? To think about collective discipline, not just being sort of Malcolm as this exceptional figure, but what that threatens. I mean, they were obsessed in these police surveillance. Constantly, the police are obsessed with trying to understand the Fruit of Islam as this paramilitary force. Because what it shows, we know that police are not disciplined. That's part of it, right? So they actually see this paramilitary force that is disciplined, and it scares them. And the other story I'll share is about inside the prison, and it's about solitary confinement. So around the same time that I'm talking about in 1961, Muslims are being thrown in solitary confinement at Attica prison constantly for things like prayer, legal materials. They're starting to write writs, suing the wardens, having the Black newspapers in their cells, having religious lessons. So they're being thrown in solitary again and again and again. And Martin Sostre and some other incarcerated organizers say, what we're going to do is we're going to fill solitary confinement purposefully as a way to sort of undermine the system, the mechanism of discipline, right? A different type of discipline. And what I think is powerful and interesting about this is that this is essentially the jail no bail strategy that Southern civil rights organizers are using at almost the exact same time in Albany, Georgia, right? Instead of bailing people out, they're saying we're going to fill the jail to the point where they can't actually use it as a mechanism of repression anymore. And the point that I make in the book is not that, we should say, okay, these are the same thing or one influences the other, but why is it that we don't know this story about people filling solitary confinement at Attica 10 years before the Attica uprising? So when I make that point about the Attica uprising being the moment that we start thinking about the prisoners' rights movement, the Attica uprising is a fruition of decades of organizing, especially by incarcerated Muslims. So it's thinking about, again, the centrality of people in prison as organizers, as activists, as people who are central to the mid-century Black freedom struggle, and thinking about the reasons why certain stories we know and certain stories we don't.
Yeah. Thank you for centering the organizing of the prisoners themselves and all the work that you're doing. We have just a couple minutes left here before we need to break for breakout rooms. And I just thought it might be interesting. I don't know if everybody here does know about Attica. And I wonder if you wanted to just say a word about what the 1971 Attica uprising or any other touchstone moment in prison rebellion looked like.
Yeah, I mean, for folks who don't know, in 1971, right, incarcerated people take over D Yard at Attica, quickly form essentially an elected government, right? They sort of like representatives of the Young Lords, the Nation of Islam, different, you know, radical white folks like Sam Melville come together. Again, talking about collective discipline, the role of the Nation of Islam in Attica was to actually protect the hostages and make sure that the guards who were being held as hostage were not harmed. So again, kind of thinking about that role and why that's important. And then, of course, the thing that I assume if people know anything about Attica, they know, which is that Rockefeller in particular wanted to make a point of this, right? He has presidential aspirations that they're not going to negotiate, especially on the point of amnesty, because that's one of the things that people inside were asking for is amnesty for the takeover. And so it's a massacre. They send in state troops to tear gas and massacre people. And then, of course, wind up trying to frame a lot of the people who were killed as sort of having stabbed guards and things like that. But I think like the historical question that comes out of Attica that's really important is 1971 is sort of the precipice before what we know as mass incarceration. So why is it that we have Attica comes after a series of rebellions? Orsammy Burton is writing a really incredible book right now on not just Attica, but this whole, we have the Tombs Rebellion. I mean, New York State prisons in the years leading up to Attica are in a state of constant rebellion. And they're transferring people between prisons. That's one of the things the prisons do to try and quell dissent is they transfer people. But of course, what that winds up doing is accelerating it because you're transferring organizers who then continue to organize. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we really need to work through, right? Is why is it that the moment of one of the sort of greatest rebellions in prisons and greatest acts of state repression in response is at the beginning of then what we know as the rise of mass incarceration, right? So that's, I mean, I think that's an open question to think about then how the state sort of responds to that.
Excellent. Thank you for breaking all that down. I think it gives us all a lot to think about, to discuss in a moment in breakout rooms, and also to think about how we center prisoners in our curriculum and make them visible to our students, imprisoned people, and also their struggles and their organizing efforts inside the prison. So I'm really excited to try to examine how to do that in my own curriculum more, and excited to see what other educators come up with out of this discussion. Maybe you can just talk about what it's like to communicate with prisoners. What are the parameters, and how often do they get to talk, and what are the restrictions and all that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as you've seen with this, right, it takes a lot of planning to make sure that that folks are included in conversations. And honestly, Stevie's been one of the people who's really pushed me on that, because I think I was planning a conference a couple years ago, and I had a lot of formerly incarcerated people there. And Stevie's one of those folks who really pushes that incarcerated people be present as well, and emphasizes the difference between being formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated, that you don't know what's happening in the prison if you're not there. And specifically, you don't know what's happening at any given prison in any given state. So there's a lot of, I think we talk about prisons in very flattened terms. And there's just a lot of different conditions, state by state, prison by prison. So in terms of communication, lots of different platforms. Some folks have access to kind of tablets like Stevie does and can do email. Sometimes those take up to 10 days to get through because of censorship, because every single thing that you send or is sent to you goes through a reader. A lot of folks, I just write snail mail. That's still, preferred. Again, that is also censored. Phone calls, but those you'll hear often on even recorded calls, like you have 1 minute remaining, right? So those are time limited, time sensitive. One of the really frustrating things about Pennsylvania prisons, where Stevie and Safear are, if you send mail to them, you send it to Florida. And then in Florida, they photocopy every single piece of mail and make a copy of it and send it to them. So the originals don't go to them, number one, and two, you have to send it to Florida to go to Pennsylvania. So yeah.
Wow. Wow. Yes. Thank you for that. There's some good questions popping up in the chat. Maybe we'll take on and hold some of my questions for later. There was a question from a STEM teacher, like science, math, technology, engineering teacher, about how do you bring in these issues into STEM classrooms that aren't social studies. And you know, I was thinking right off the bat, like, well, we just had a question about environmental racism and how that impacted the prison. So I'm thinking, you know, when you're teaching about climate change and science, right? When you're teaching about environment and pollution and that kind of thing, there's an opportunity for an intersection. And so there's that. And then somebody asked a question about using prison-centered language that could be interesting to respond to. And then I'm seeing a question here. Oh, the chat is moving so quickly. How do you consider your positionality in this work and your interactions with incarcerated people, and how do you intentionally address disparate power and privilege of your position versus the folks you work with?
Yeah, so I'll try to address both those questions about language and positionality. So there's not one sort of set. I don't think everyone agrees about language, right? For the most part, folks in the movement don't use the language of the state. So that's like inmates, facilities, the sort of euphemisms, right, that the state creates to sort of hide what it's doing. And yeah, it's usually person-centered. So you say, you know, incarcerated people, imprisoned people, again, emphasizing Stevie's point that it's people who are inside. I still use the term prisoner, and I know other folks who do, in part because it's a descriptor of what the state is doing, right? It's imprisoning people. So you could use imprisoned person, but it's not a term that the state uses. The state does not use prisoner because they don't want to draw attention to the fact that that's what they're doing. They use the euphemisms. I know in Oregon, adults in custody, AIC. And then in terms of privilege, I mean, yeah, it's something I think about every single day in what I do. And in part, it's, you know, trying to use, sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not missing. Trying to use my position as a way to redistribute resources, to draw attention to issues, to work with people inside. For the most part, you know, the people I work with inside, we're organizing together, right? It's not like a sort of research relationship or something like that. It's us organizing for PIC abolition. So, you know, in things like tonight, trying to use this platform as a space for Safear and Stevie to have access to it and to have their voices heard. Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up question that's just, how do we center the voices of those involved and avoid a complex savior and interpret the role of toxic masculinity and mass incarceration? I saw that in the chat. And then there is questions about resources to learn more about this, and then specifically children's texts. So I bet there are educators on here that know more about children's texts as well. But if you have any thoughts on any of those questions, and then we can move to a couple others we have if Stevie hasn't called in yet. Okay.
No. So I was going to say Missing Daddy is a children's text by Miriam Kaba. I don't know if that showed up yet, but that's one that I've used in the past.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, everybody should get that book who has kids or teaches younger kids, even older youth. I think we'll get a lot out of that book for sure. Well, I guess if Stevie hasn't called in, we can stop anytime he calls, if he's able to join us. But I also was hoping that you could comment on attacks from academic institutions and state legislatures on teaching about these kind of topics and anti-racist pedagogy and activism, that you think is important to know about right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll say this with the caveat that you all know better than I do, for folks who are especially K through 12 educators, what that looks like and how to fight that. But I saw most recently in Idaho, I think there's a bill attacking this critical race studies, which the right is now very interested in and has no idea what that is. And in part, it connects to the thing that we were talking about earlier with the Nation of Islam. Actually, I was just thinking about how this idea that speaking out against racism is somehow racist, how this kind of like claim of reverse racism goes back to the way that the Nation of Islam was denounced.
Yeah.
So I talk about the hate that hate produced, which is this whole sort of introduction of the Nation of Islam to white people, that's meant to essentially say Black nationalism is actually reverse hate. And we see that same kind of, rhetoric deployed now. And the other thing that I wanted to bring attention to is, again, what Stevie's dealing with, right? Which is all of the sort of attacks that we see from state legislatures on anti-racist education, universities. It's happening in a much more acute, condensed way in prisons. So part of the reason that I spend so much of my time just getting books inside, or Stevie and I are working on a zine project right now that sort of translates academic texts into zine form. One, because they're more accessible, and two, because you can get them inside more easily. But just a couple days ago, he had 14 books that were banned that he got sent. And these are things like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Angela Davis, Black Power Afterlives. And it's the same logic. So I wrote down some of these are the direct quotes. Freedom is a Constant Struggle, they didn't let in because they said it's a security threat group. BPP, Black Panther Party, and KKK. So this idea that the Black Panthers and the KKK are somehow like mirror images of each other. Pedagogy of the Oppressed says it fights to destroy causes, revolution or transform, promote a climate of hopelessness. So obviously these people aren't reading that book, because we all know Pedagogy of the Oppressed does nothing if not create hope. But all of these are said to be creating danger in the prison, right? And I don't know if you all have that photo that I sent earlier of the prison library. Yeah, it looks like, so this is Stevie and I talking earlier today on video chat. And if you can see the thing that he's pointing to with his pen, that black bin is the library for his entire block. So that's the whole library for that block for the last year. And he was talking about how with COVID, they've opened up the gym, but not the library. So not only are we talking about the repression that's happening to Stevie in terms of what books he can get in, but that's also the whole library. So part of this is, for me, is kind of a push for me to, say like all the things that you're concerned about with your students and the world outside is happening 100-fold for folks whose experiences, especially with formal education, have been largely carceral to begin with, who've been shut out of formal education and continue to be. So I think it's something that we should all care about and be pushing for, against prison censorship, making sure books get inside, supporting study groups inside.
Yeah, it's outrageous that that's the only access to books that they have can fit in that. And then what they
I guess what books are in there, yeah.
And what books are in there, right? And I was thinking about that question about women and imprisonment, and thinking about this book, Invisible No More, that I've learned so much from, with introduction by Angela Davis, written by Andrea Ritchie, and police violence against Black women and women of color comes to mind. But, you know, also there are so many issues facing incarcerated women as well that are worth studying and bringing into the classroom, especially around, you know, health issues and childbirth in prison and all kinds of injustices that they face as well.
Here, as long as we're grabbing books off of our shelves.
Yeah.
Also recommend Captive Genders for folks who haven't come across this book, in just thinking about the way the PIC specifically targets non-binary and trans folks. Even though, you know, I think it's so important to think about the way the prison constructs gender, right? So what are the experiences of trans and non-binary people in prisons who are then classified? And then this sort of new, like, neoliberal gender responsive prisons, as if that's kind of the answer, right? It's another form of co-optation by the state. So yeah, a lot of the stuff I would say most of our, I guess we haven't gotten into Study and Struggle, but most of the folks who are in our study groups in Mississippi are at the sort of state designated women's prison. But that includes, you know, trans folks. Certainly.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much. I have not read that book, but I will add it to my list. It sounds fascinating and important to bring into the classroom. And I think that leads us to a question about Study and Struggle. Can you talk about this initiative that you're part of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should just say, I still haven't heard. I reached out to our comrade as well. He hasn't heard from Stevie, so it might just be, you know, all sorts of things. Yeah, so Study and Struggle is it kind of grows out of that earlier effort that I talked about to support self-led radical study groups in prisons. So we have about 150 people who are participating in radical study groups year-round in Mississippi prisons. What we do is we support by sending the books and the materials and the curriculum inside. We put money on people's commissaries so they have money for letters and stamps and food and drinks and things. And then from September through the end of the year, we have sort of a more robust curriculum where people are connected through a pen pal program with outside groups. So anyone in this call could host a group, participate in a 4-month bi-weekly study group where you're connected with people inside and are, you know, studying the same things. We also have a webinar series we call Critical Conversations once a month, where people talk about the themes for the month, authors, organizers, and then we send those transcripts inside. And it's also a fully bilingual curriculum, so it's in Spanish and English.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I love it. I love it. That's such great work.
Oh, can I also say, Jesse, for this crowd, one of the things that we're really trying to do this coming fall is make it more accessible for K through 12. So thinking about building a curriculum, and it's all online for free. So it's all PDF form.
Oh, that's so important. We'll look out for that and hopefully be able to work and help disseminate some of that. And I've been thinking about how I could get more involved with reaching out to supporting prisoner organizing too. So I appreciate that. Yeah, unfortunately, you know, all the barriers for imprisoned people to reach the outside world. So we have not heard from Stevie yet, but we do have another recording with commentary from Safear Ness about what should happen to prisons that we can play in just a moment to close us out. I just want to look at the chat and see if there's any last questions before we get to that. Let's see, there were people who were asking about lesson plans for teaching about mass incarceration. And we definitely have some important lessons in the book, Teaching for Black Lives, and also on the Zinn Education Project website. In the book I helped co-edit called Teaching for Black Lives, we have lessons about the prison industrial complex. We have an interview with Michelle Alexander about the school to prison pipeline. That is a really important document you can use to help inform your pedagogy, but also you can have your students read that interview and learn a lot from it. And there's also a really powerful lesson in the book Teaching for Black Lives that is written by a high school student, and she explains her experience with having her father incarcerated and the kind of trauma that inflicted on her growing up, and then her own experience with law enforcement and the juvenile detention. So those are really critical lessons, I think, for engaging our youth in these discussions. Let's see. Were there any other questions that I missed, Sierra or Deborah? Okay. Excellent. Well, in that case, I think we can move to playing the commentary from Safear Ness about what should happen to prisons, and then Dr. Felber, if you have any closing comments when that's done. All right.
That's why the only humane prison is a prison that doesn't exist. That's the truth. And as a society, we have to stop dealing with our problems by putting people in human cages. You know, give people on the street the resources that they need. Give people the job security. Give people homes. Give people access to adequate medical care. Give people access to drug treatment. Give people access to all of these things, and you're going to see your communities become safer. Keep putting people in prison. Prison hasn't been working. It's only been getting worse.
Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Fayette.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
Keep putting them in prison, and you're going to keep getting the same result. You know, that's it. That's it. Ian.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, the abolition of the prison industrial complex isn't just about getting rid of these cages, but it's about reinvesting that money into our communities, into schools, into healthcare, into housing for all, so that our communities will thrive and we won't need those facilities at all. So, Dr. Felber, I don't know if you have some closing words for our educators about what they can do and should be thinking about as they go back to the classroom.
Yeah, I was frantically trying to find this, but if anyone knows of it and could link it in the chat. So Mariam Kaba, I think at the beginning of this year, had a really handy 9 things that you can sort of do if you're making a commitment to PIC abolition. They were things like, phone zaps, writing to incarcerated people, mutual aid. So I think there's a lot of ways for people to get connected, right? Just whether it's just supporting someone inside, asking what folks need, doing mutual aid with local community groups, things like that. There's a lot of just, I think often it can seem like a really intimidating thing to get involved in, and it seems like it's just about the prison, but right, the PIC is the sprawling thing. I mean, if you work in schools, you know how the carceral system touches schools. So no matter where you are, there's some way that our punishment system is touching your life. And if it's touching your life, that's a space to organize. So that's what I would say. And then, the sort of myth that you got at, right, which is that, and Safear mentioned, that prisons make us safer. So prisons are not about making us safer. They are the leading sort of perpetuator of harm. And I think we have the link, right, to Stevie's written comments. So that's something that people can check out too. Stevie makes this really important distinction, and a lot of abolitionists do, between harm and crime. So that's something that I encourage you. Yes, thank you, Ursula. Mariam Kaba's commitments. But as an opening with your students, if you want to just talk about the difference between crime and harm, that's a really great conversation, because so often we think about those things as the same. But crime is a social construct. It changes over time. Harm is something that all prison abolitionists are concerned with, but that's not the same thing as crime. And again, you can do a similar sort of exercise when thinking about the difference between punishment and accountability. And this is a point that Mariam Kaba makes all the time, that when we talk about accountability, we're often mistaking that for punishment. And those are not the same things. Accountability requires that the person actually want to be held accountable. Otherwise, you're just inflicting punishment upon them. So I think either of those, kind of working through the difference between punishment and accountability, or harm and crime, are good ways that you can just open up a conversation about the logics of the carceral state that we too often take for granted.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for lifting up Miriam Kaba's work. Everyone should read her new book, We Do This Till We Free Us. And also there's a playlist that goes with that. I think we might hear some cuts from, but you can find that playlist on Spotify. And if you'll notice in the chat, there's a link to Miriam Kaba's commitments, and also to Stevie Wilson's written response to the question. So you can hear more from him there as well. And so I just want to thank you deeply, Dr. Felber, for joining us today and for helping us hear the words of incarcerated people. And deep thanks, and please send our gratitude to Safear and to Stevie.